Mr. Herman declares that he is one of the toughest men on the planet, if not the toughest. And whether or not you are prepared to take his word for it now, as he tells you so, he is absolutely sure you will agree with him by the time you've finished the book. And he's right. By the time you've finished the book, you'll know that over the course of these few hundred pages, you've been in the company of the toughest man on earth, physically, mentally, and spiritually. This was definitely a man with a very strong body and a strong character to go with it. Victor Herman had been born in Michigan, but he had moved to Russia during the 1930s when his father went there to work in a factory built by the Ford Motor Company. Victor Herman, who was in his early 20s at the time, was also arrested for being politically unreliable and was sent to Siberia. The philosophy of the Soviet prison system at the time was very simple. Prisoners were simply worked to death. In the Arctic cold of the Siberian winters and the mosquito-infested, unbearably humid summers, the camp inmates were given one impossible task after another. With inadequate clothing, impossibly poor equipment, and almost no food. Faced with this kind of existence, a prisoner would inevitably lose his will to live, and death would occur not long afterward. Victor Herman was an amazing exception to this rule. Though he had no real hope of a life outside the camps, though he had nothing to live for in the sense that most of us are used to, there was something inside him that refused to be broken, just out of sheer stubbornness, just out of sheer strength of character. At one point, a special task was arranged for Mr. Herman, something the camp administrators were certain that he wouldn't survive. Early one frozen morning, he was sent out into the forest with only a single guard accompanying him, and there he was shown several dozen full-size trees that had been cut down and stripped of their branches so that they could be used as telephone poles. He was then ordered to single-handedly load the trees onto some railroad flat cars before the end of the day. It was literally an impossible task, like something out of a fairy tale or a bad dream. But Victor Herman did it. Somehow he did it, simply because he refused to be beaten or to give up. It was a miracle, but it actually happened. It was a feat that dwarfed the accomplishments of any Olympic athlete. And as it happened, Victor Herman was in an excellent position to make that particular judgment, since after his release from the camps in the 1950s, he became coach of the Soviet Olympic boxing team. The author of Coming Out of the Ice performed many heroic feats during his years in Siberia, but he considered the incident with the telephone poles to be his masterpiece. As he worked, he was watched by only the armed guard, who just stood there silently throughout the day, probably half frozen to death himself, and undoubtedly completely dumbfounded by what was happening before his very eyes. When the impossible job was finished, Victor Herman could not resist walking up to the guard and throwing his arms around him. This incredible display of physical and mental toughness simply had to be celebrated somehow, even if only with a Russian prison guard in the middle of a vast Siberian forest. As Herman described it, the guard allowed him a brief smile, and then the two men trudged back to the camp, where Herman endured many more years of incarceration before his eventual release, his remarkable Olympic career, and finally his return to the United States after almost 30 years in the Soviet Union. Victor Herman's amazing story certainly deserves to be told, and I believe there's a great deal to be learned from his accomplishments. But it's not what you might think. I'm not going to suggest that you can be like Victor Herman or that you should even try. In fact, I think the value and the extraordinary power of his story lies largely in the differences between what this man accomplished and what we can expect of ourselves. To me, the most amazing fact about Victor Herman's survival is the fact that he found motivation entirely within himself. Nobody cared whether he lived or died. He had no reason to think he would ever have a life outside the prison camps. It was made obvious to him throughout every minute of every day that his captors were simply waiting for him to give in and growing more and more impatient about it all the time. To me, the fact that Victor Herman managed to maintain his will to live under these conditions of total isolation is even more amazing than the things he accomplished with his body. Very few people are able to develop this kind of intrinsic motivation. That's just an axiom of human nature. Most of us, virtually all of us in fact, need reasons outside of ourselves in order to accomplish anything of significance. We can still be people of strong character, but we need something outside ourselves to help us become as strong as we can be. Just sort of wanting to be financially successful is rarely enough to make it happen. Just wanting to learn a new skill, or give up a self-destructive habit, or make some other major change in your lifestyle usually won't cut the mustard. But what if you had to get a large amount of money in order to afford the very best medical care for someone you love? What if you had to learn how to speak a new language in order to save a family member who had been imprisoned in a foreign country? Or if you had to change your way of living in order to find a way out of some other life or death situation? Your motivation would move to a much higher level. If you're like most people, having to is a lot stronger than wanting to. But often, and especially when you're young, that difference isn't always clear until someone points it out to you. In my own life, it was my mentor, the late Mr. Earl Schoaf, who pointed out the distinction between wanting to on the one hand and really wanting to, or even having to, on the other. By doing so, Mr. Schoaf did me a great favor, and after we'd talked about this, I felt for the first time I was really pointed in the direction of success. The way it happened was really very simple and straightforward. Mr. Schoaf simply took me aside one day and said, "Jim, you have enough talent and intelligence to really..." Accomplish a lot in life, but you just don't have enough reasons to make it happen. When I heard that, something clicked inside my head. This was truly a key insight, a turning point in my life. I had always doubted if I had enough ability to be successful, but suddenly I realized that having enough ability was not the problem. The problem was having enough reasons. I'm no Victor Herman, and frankly, I doubt whether you are either. We don't have the willpower to achieve success in a vacuum, as if we were standing out in the middle of a Siberian forest loading logs. We need all the help we can get in terms of motivation, but of course different people are motivated by different things.
Thank you for watching our video.